The first thing I noticed was that someone had moved our cooler. It was sitting about 20 feet away from where we'd left it, half hidden behind a fallen pine tree. And for a few seconds I honestly thought I was looking at the wrong campsite. It was around 2:30 in the morning, and the only light came from the dying embers of our fire and the small flashlight I was holding. My friend Daniel was asleep inside the tent behind me, and I could hear him breathing through the thin nylon wall. We had driven nearly 4 hours into the mountains that afternoon, looking for a quiet place to spend the weekend, and by midnight the forest had become so silent that every little sound seemed amplified. Earlier that night we joked about bears getting into our food. So when I first saw the cooler away from the fire, that was what I assumed had happened. I walked toward it slowly, expecting to see claw marks or spilled food. Nothing. The lid was still closed. The straps were still fastened. There wasn't even dirt around it. I crouched down and touched the side. It was cold and damp from the night air. I remember whispering, "Daniel," even though I knew he couldn't hear me through the tent. I dragged the cooler back toward our campsite and placed it beside the picnic table. Then I noticed something else. There was a set of footprints in the dirt between the cooler and the trees. They weren't animal tracks. They were human footprints, and they were fresh enough that the edges hadn't collapsed. I stood there staring at them for probably 30 seconds, trying to convince myself they belonged to us. They didn't. Daniel had worn hiking boots with a wide tread, and I'd been wearing sneakers. These prints were narrow, with a smooth sole and a strange diagonal mark across the heel. They led from the trees toward our campsite, stopped beside the cooler, and then continued back into the darkness. I woke Daniel immediately. He came out of the tent rubbing his eyes and asked what was wrong. I pointed at the ground. He stared for a moment and then said, "Maybe another camper?" I reminded him that the nearest marked campsite was almost a mile away, and that we'd chosen this spot specifically because nobody else was supposed to be nearby. He shrugged, but I could tell he was uncomfortable. We checked our other belongings. Nothing seemed missing. Our backpacks were still where we'd left them, our phones were on the picnic table, and the tent hadn't been touched. Daniel suggested we just get back inside and lock the tent zippers. I didn't like the idea, but I agreed. For the next hour, neither of us slept. Every few minutes we'd hear something moving through the trees. Sometimes it sounded like branches rubbing together, and sometimes it sounded unmistakably like footsteps. At one point, 3 slow steps came from somewhere behind our tent. Crunch, crunch, then nothing. Daniel whispered, "Did you hear that?" I nodded. We stayed completely still. A few minutes later, something brushed against the side of the tent. The nylon flexed inward for a second, as if someone had pressed a hand against it, and then it disappeared. Daniel grabbed my arm so hard that his fingers hurt. Neither of us said anything. We didn't want whoever was outside to know we were awake. Eventually the sound stopped, and sometime after 4 we must have fallen asleep. When I woke up, sunlight was coming through the tent. Daniel was already awake, staring at the ceiling. The first thing he said was, "We need to leave." I asked why, and he pointed toward the entrance. There was a small folded piece of paper sitting on the ground just outside the tent. Neither of us had seen it before. Daniel unzipped the tent only far enough to reach out and grab it. Inside was a single sentence written in black ink, "You should not have stayed here." We looked at each other. There was no name, no explanation, nothing else. Daniel wanted to pack immediately, but I convinced him to wait until daylight was stronger. We walked around the campsite looking for any sign of whoever had been there. That's when we found another set of footprints, this time behind the tent. They followed the tree line and disappeared toward a steep slope, We packed everything as quickly as we could. While I was loading the last bag into the car, Daniel called me over. He was standing beside the driver's door, staring at the ground. There was a small metal key lying in the dirt. It wasn't ours. I picked it up and noticed a number stamped into it. 17. Daniel said it probably belonged to another campsite, but neither of us knew why someone would leave it there. We drove out just before noon. About 20 minutes down the mountain, we reached the ranger station we'd passed on the way in. An older ranger was sitting outside and Daniel stopped the car. We showed him the note and the key. His expression changed immediately. He asked us exactly where we'd camped. We told him the location. He was quiet for several seconds before saying, "You weren't supposed to be there." We explained that we'd used an old forest road and found a flat clearing. The ranger shook his head. He told us that area had been closed for years because an abandoned fire lookout stood farther up the slope, and people had been using the old access road to break into it. He asked whether we'd seen anyone. Daniel handed him the note. The ranger read it, then looked toward the mountain. "Did you see a red pickup?" he asked. We said no. He asked whether we'd heard an engine during the night. I remembered hearing something around 3 in the morning, but I hadn't thought much of it. The ranger told us there had been several reports of stolen gear from campers in that area. Someone had apparently been watching people from the old lookout and coming down at night when they were asleep. Then he looked at the key in my hand and asked where we'd found it. I showed him the number. His face went completely serious. "That's not a campsite key," he said. "That's a master key from the old lookout building." He told us the building had been locked for years. Daniel asked why someone would have a key to it. The ranger didn't answer. Instead, he asked us one final question. "Did you notice anything unusual about the trees around your tent?" I thought about it and remembered one detail I'd completely forgotten. There had been a tiny red piece of fabric tied to a branch about 30 feet behind our campsite. I described it to him. The ranger's expression hardened. He told us that wasn't a trail marker. It was a signal. Then he looked past us toward the road and said, very quietly, "You need to get out of here before whoever left that signal realizes you found it." I turned toward the mountain behind us, and through the windshield I saw a red pickup slowly coming down the same road we just escaped from. I had always considered myself pretty comfortable in the woods, which was probably why I ignored several things that should have made me turn around much earlier. It happened during a 3-day camping trip I took with my younger brother, Ryan, and 2 friends, Marcus and Eli, in late October. We wanted one last trip before the weather became too cold, so we chose a remote campground beside a lake that we'd been told was usually empty that time of year. The campground wasn't completely primitive, but it was isolated enough that there were no houses for several miles. And after sunset, there was almost no light except what came from the stars and our fire. We arrived shortly before dark on a Friday evening. The ranger station was closed, so we checked the map posted outside, found our campsite, and drove another mile down a narrow dirt road. The place looked perfect. There was a wooden picnic table, a fire ring, and a narrow path leading down toward the lake. Nobody else was there. We set up 2 tents, collected firewood, cooked dinner, and spent most of the evening talking. Around 11, Ryan mentioned that he'd heard something moving near the lake. We all stopped talking and listened. At first there was nothing, then we heard a splash. Marcus laughed and said it was probably a fish. A few minutes later, we heard another splash, followed by what sounded like someone walking through shallow water. I stood up and shined my flashlight toward the lake, but the beam barely reached the shoreline. "Hello?" I called. There was no answer. Eli joked that if somebody was swimming in that freezing water, they were crazier than us. We sat back down, but nobody really relaxed after that. Around midnight, we went into our tents. Ryan and I shared one while Marcus and Eli slept in the other. I remember waking up sometime after 2 because I heard a faint metallic sound outside. It sounded like someone dragging something across the picnic table. I held my breath and listened. Scrape, pause, scrape. I whispered Ryan's name. He was awake. "You hear that?" he asked. I nodded. Neither of us wanted to leave the tent, so we waited. After a minute, the sound stopped. Then we heard footsteps moving around the tent. Slow footsteps, not rushed, as if whoever was outside knew exactly where they were going. The steps went from the front of the tent to the side, then disappeared behind us. Ryan whispered, "Maybe it's a ranger." I told him no ranger would be walking around a campsite at 2 in the morning without saying anything. We stayed silent for several minutes. Eventually the forest became quiet again. In the morning we found nothing unusual. Marcus thought we had heard an animal, and Eli blamed the wind. I wasn't convinced, but daylight made everything feel less threatening. We spent most of Saturday hiking around the lake. During the afternoon, we found an old wooden structure hidden among the trees. It looked like a hunting shelter, although the roof had partially collapsed. Inside were a few empty cans, a broken chair, and a pile of old blankets. We joked that someone had been camping there before us. What bothered me was that some of the blankets looked relatively clean. I picked one up and found a cigarette underneath it. The cigarette wasn't old. It was still slightly soft, and the filter looked almost untouched. Ryan told me to leave it alone. We did. On the way back to camp, we noticed a narrow trail we'd missed earlier. It went deeper into the woods and seemed to run parallel to our campground. There were fresh footprints along it. We followed them for maybe 50 yards before deciding to turn around. That evening, we cooked earlier and stayed closer to the fire. Nobody wanted to admit it, but the mood had changed. Around 10, we heard a vehicle somewhere in the distance. The sound of an engine slowly approached, then stopped. We looked at each other. The campground road ended at our site, so there shouldn't have been anywhere else for a vehicle to go. We waited. Nothing happened. About 20 minutes later, I heard a door slam. I stood up and looked into the darkness. A faint white light appeared between the trees. It moved slowly, disappeared, then appeared again. "Someone's coming?" Marcus whispered. We turned off our headlamps and let the fire burn low. The light stopped about 100 yards away. Then it vanished. We waited for someone to emerge, but nobody did. After another 10 minutes, Eli suggested that we call out. I told him not to. Something about the way the light had stopped made me uneasy. We eventually went to bed, but this time I kept my phone beside me. Around 1:40 in the morning, I woke up to a sound that made my stomach drop. Someone was whispering outside our tent. I couldn't make out the words, but the voice was definitely human. I nudged Ryan awake. We listened. The whispering stopped. Then a voice said, "Are you guys awake?" It was Marcus's voice. Ryan immediately reached for the zipper, but I grabbed his wrist. "That's not Marcus," I whispered. We both knew Marcus's voice well enough to recognize it, and something about the voice outside was wrong. It sounded flatter, almost like someone imitating him without knowing exactly how he spoke. We stayed silent. A few seconds later, the voice came again. "Ryan?" "Open the tent." Ryan's breathing became rapid. Then the person outside walked away. We heard footsteps crossing toward the second tent. A moment later, Marcus shouted from inside it, "What the hell?" The footsteps stopped. Then everything went silent. We heard Marcus whispering to Eli, followed by the zipper of their tent opening slightly. "Don't come out," I yelled. There was a pause. Then Marcus said, "Why?" I told him there was someone outside pretending to be him. He immediately closed the zipper. For the next hour, nobody moved. Eventually, we heard a vehicle start somewhere beyond the trees. The engine remained low for several seconds before disappearing down the road. At sunrise, we came out of the tents together. There were footprints all around the campsite. Whoever had been there had walked around both tents, the fire ring, and the picnic table. One set of footprints stopped directly beside my side of the tent. There was also a fresh cigarette, but lying in the dirt. Ryan picked it up and said, "That's the same brand as the one we found yesterday." We decided to leave immediately. While packing, Marcus noticed something carved into the picnic table. It was a phone number. Underneath it, someone had written, "Call after dark." We didn't call. We drove back toward the ranger station and stopped at a small gas station about 20 miles away. An employee there listened to our story and told us something that made the entire thing worse. He said people had complained for years about someone camping illegally near the lake and approaching visitors at night. Police had searched the area before but never found anyone. Then he asked us whether we'd noticed a white light moving between the trees. When I said yes, he nodded. "That's how he watches people," he said. "He uses an old access road behind the campground and stays hidden in the woods." I asked how he knew so much. He looked at us for a moment and said his brother had gone missing there 2 years earlier. He had been camping alone and never came home. His vehicle was found 3 days later with the keys still inside. We left the gas station shortly afterward. None of us talked much during the drive. But when we were almost home, Ryan looked through the rear window and suddenly said, "Slow down." I asked why. He pointed at the highway behind us. About 4 cars back was a dark SUV that had been following us since the gas station. I changed lanes. It changed lanes too. I sped up, it stayed behind us. Then Ryan noticed something hanging from the rearview mirror of the SUV, a small piece of red fabric, the same color as the signal we'd seen at the campsite. I kept driving, trying to convince myself it was a coincidence, until the SUV pulled alongside us at the next intersection. The driver's window lowered. I expected to see a stranger. Instead, I saw a familiar face. It was the campground ranger we'd met the previous summer. He looked directly at me, raised one finger to his lips, and mouthed 2 words through the glass: "Don't stop." I didn't believe the story my friend Tyler told me about the campsite until I was standing there myself, staring at the empty tent beside a fire that was still burning. It had been my idea to go camping that weekend, and Tyler had warned me that the campground we were heading to was isolated, but he hadn't mentioned anything that would have made me change my mind. We had driven nearly 3 hours from the city, following a narrow road through thick forest until the pavement disappeared completely. There was no cell service for most of the drive, and by the time we reached the campground, the sun was already dropping behind the trees. There were 6 designated sites, but only 2 were occupied. An older couple was packing up at one of them, and another site farther down the road appeared empty. We chose the one closest to the lake because it had a flat area for our tent and a fire ring already built into the ground. Tyler had been camping since he was a kid, so I let him handle most of the setup while I collected firewood. Everything felt normal until I noticed a small orange ribbon tied around a tree about 50 yards from our campsite. I assumed it was a trail marker and didn't think much of it. After dinner, we sat around the fire drinking coffee and talking. Around 10, the older couple drove away, leaving us as the only people in the campground. Tyler watched their headlights disappear between the trees and said, "Now it's just us." He laughed when he said it, but something about the way he looked into the darkness afterward made me ask if he was nervous. He told me he'd been there once before, years earlier, and had left before sunrise because someone kept walking around his campsite at night. I thought he was joking. He wasn't. He said he'd heard footsteps circling his tent for almost an hour, but whenever he looked outside, there was nobody there. Eventually, he'd packed everything into his truck and left. I asked why he had agreed to come back. He shrugged and said, "Because I figured whoever it was is probably long gone." We laughed about it and changed the subject. Around midnight, we went to sleep. I woke sometime after 2 because I heard a faint tapping sound. At first, I thought a branch was hitting the tent, but the rhythm was too consistent. Tap, tap, pause, tap, tap. I opened my eyes and listened. Tyler was still asleep beside me. The tapping continued, but now it seemed to be coming from the opposite side of the tent. I reached for my flashlight and turned it on without unzipping the tent. The light made the nylon glow, but I couldn't see anything outside. Then the tapping stopped. I waited. Nothing. I finally relaxed and closed my eyes. A few seconds later, something pressed against the tent wall directly beside my face. It wasn't a branch. The fabric pushed inward slowly, creating the unmistakable outline of fingers. I froze. The hand remained there for perhaps 3 seconds before disappearing. I grabbed Tyler's shoulder and woke him. He looked at me confused until I pointed at the wall. He immediately understood. We didn't speak. We listened for footsteps, but whoever had been outside wasn't moving. Tyler slowly reached for his phone. There was no signal. He whispered that we should stay inside until daylight. I agreed. About 20 minutes later, we heard footsteps moving away from the tent. They went toward the lake. Then we heard something metallic hit the ground. Tyler whispered, "That's our cooler." We had left it beside the fire ring, and I could hear it being dragged across the dirt. The sound moved slowly toward the trees. Tyler finally decided to look. He unzipped the tent just enough to shine his flashlight outside. The beam swept across the fire ring, the picnic table, and the trees. Nobody was there, but the cooler was gone. We didn't sleep again. At first light, we stepped outside together. The cooler was sitting about 30 yards away, behind a cluster of bush. Its lid was open. Nothing had been stolen. Instead, every item inside had been removed and placed neatly on the ground. Bottles, food containers, ice packs, everything was arranged in a straight line. Tyler stared at it and said, "We need to leave." I agreed. While packing, I noticed something strange near the tent. There were footprints in the dirt, but they didn't lead toward the lake. They started behind our tent and followed the tree line toward the campground road. I followed them for a few steps and discovered that they continued past our campsite, straight toward the empty site where the older couple had been staying. There, half buried beneath leaves, I found a small plastic storage container. Inside were photographs. At first I thought they were old family pictures, but when I looked closer I realized every photograph showed people camping. Different campsites, different families, different years. In several pictures people were asleep inside tents. Some had been taken from a distance, through trees. Others were close enough to see the faces of the campers through the tent fabric. Tyler told me to put the photographs back, but I couldn't. One picture showed our campsite from the previous night. Our tent was clearly visible, and the timestamp on the corner showed 11:43 p.m. We hadn't arrived until after 7. and nobody had been near us when we'd set up. I turned the picture over. On the back was written, Site 4. Tyler grabbed my arm and told me we were leaving immediately. We threw everything into the truck and drove toward the campground entrance. About a mile down the road, we found a wooden gate across the path. It hadn't been there when we'd arrived. A heavy chain was wrapped around it, and there was a handwritten sign saying the road was closed due to maintenance. Tyler got out and tried to move the chain, but it was locked. We had no choice except to turn around. He suggested taking an old service road we'd noticed earlier, so we headed back toward the campground. As we approached the turnoff, I noticed something standing beside the road. It was a person. They were wearing a dark jacket and facing away from us. Tyler slowed down. The person didn't move. We passed within 20 feet of them. As soon as we were beside them, they turned their head toward the truck. I couldn't see their face clearly, but I could tell they were smiling. Tyler accelerated. We took the service road, which quickly became rough and narrow. Branches scraped against the truck, and the forest closed in around us. After several minutes, Tyler stopped suddenly. I asked what was wrong. He pointed ahead. The road ended at an old wooden cabin. The cabin looked abandoned from the outside, but smoke was coming from its chimney. There was a pickup parked beside it. Tyler immediately recognized it. It was the same truck he'd seen near his campsite years earlier. We reversed slowly, but before we could turn around, headlights appeared behind us. Another vehicle had entered the service road. We were trapped between the cabin and the approaching truck. Tyler killed the engine. Neither of us spoke. The headlights stopped about 50 feet away. A door opened. Footsteps approached. Then someone knocked on my window. I looked toward Tyler. He was staring straight ahead, completely pale. The person outside knocked again, harder this time. Then a voice came through the glass. "You forgot something at the campsite." Tyler shook his head. The voice continued, calm and almost friendly. "The photographs." I looked down at the floor between my feet. The plastic container we'd found was still there. Then I heard another sound behind us. The cabin door had opened. Someone else was walking toward the truck from the opposite direction. Tyler whispered, "Don't move." I could hear 2 sets of footsteps closing in on us. Then the person beside my window leaned closer, and I finally saw his face clearly. It was the campground ranger who had supposedly been miles away at the station when we'd arrived. He smiled through the glass and raised the same orange ribbon I'd seen tied to the tree. Then he whispered, "We've been waiting for someone to find these."